Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Interim Execs having a chat with expert COOs, Chief Operating Officers. We're going to talk about at least 5 operational improvements for your bigger success in 2020. I'm very grateful. My name is Bob Jordan. I'm joined by Olivia Wagner. We run Interim Execs, which is worldwide matching of very smart companies with smart executives. We're joined today by Mike Bartikoski. He is a veteran COO. He was Senior Vice President Operations at Landafrost. He's had, his career is just stunning. At Hershey's, Nestle, PepsiCo, Quaker Oats, E.J. Gallo, and Coca-Cola. We're also very grateful that Steve Raack could join us, veteran COO. He was COO of Beauty Counter. He helped launch and grow the company in the first 2 years by 1,500%. Want to hear about that? He led global operations at Herbalife. He's had leading operational roles at health and wellness company Arbonne. He was COO of a $500 million skincare and nutritional supplements brand. So Steve and Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Appreciate it. Thanks for letting us be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
So we're going to dive right in here, guys. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of operations because so many companies have breakdowns in process. Steve, why don't we start with you? You developed a framework for efficient process. Can you tell us what that looks like?
Yeah, definitely. So, management consulting days, we looked at lots of corporations from process improvement, M&A, and different areas there. And I started bucketing those types of initiatives into 3 buckets: order, ship, and pay. And so on the operations side, we were looking at, do we have the right processes, the right talent, the right people in place to make sure that we have the right products with the right SKUs in the right locations in the right quantities. And so from an order standpoint, we were looking at, those types of things. Now there's a lot underneath that, of course. And then we went and looked at the ship operations. So shipping can be very expensive. We have to compete with Amazons and different things of that nature. So how are we looking at our warehousing strategy, whether it's domestic or global around the world? What are those processes? What are the arrangements with the 3PLs if you're using them, or the service providers directly, and then the pay side of things. So order, ship, and pay. If you can't pay your bills, no one's going to want to work with you. So order, ship, and pay was a strategy that we put in place. And so we then started dissecting organizations and processes around that to make sure that they were efficient, because if you can't place the order, you can't ship them. If you can't ship them, you can't pay the people, and your business starts to have problems. So that's pretty much the strategy we looked at order, ship, and pay.
Mike, what does framework look like for you?
I think Steve has summarized it pretty well. As you look at, for most manufacturers, I'm in the food and beverage business, making sure that we've got good customer interface, that we're shipping well, and that we're processing those things in a timely fashion is really important to us. Conversion in the middle is obviously a big piece for us, and making sure that, you're doing that as effectively as possible with, the right levels of inventory, minimum levels of inventory, so you're not tying up cash in the wrong things. I think we're going to talk later about, what's core. And I think Steve kind of alluded to that in his statement, about those things. What are the items that you need to have, and are they in the right places? Having that kind of network understanding, I think, is really imperative for people as they're looking at improving their business. Going back in time, you look at where we used to be. For example, we were with Gallo. We had a lot of pre-positioned inventory, based on poor forecasts, that was the wrong inventory in the wrong place at the wrong quantity. Systems have evolved today that I think, firms have the opportunity to be much better at that and make sure that their network is really better fit to their consumption profile.
Thank you for bringing that up, because you're touching on something, internally we call it blood in the streets. What we say to executives when we meet them is, give us examples of where there was just something was really wrong, and tell us about the decisions you made. Tell us about the actions and the results. Steve, can you give us an example from your own experience? Tell us when something went horribly wrong, and what did you do?
So I have a system one that was probably the toughest piece of it all. So we become very reliant on data, especially in large global organizations. And we actually had a pretty good handoff process with our technology partners in the IT system, just IT environment. But at one point in time, the IT team decided to push a family patch of Oracle into the system and didn't tell us in the ops side. Go forward a couple of weeks and everything was working fine. Our planners were doing what they were doing. The transportation folks were doing what they were doing. But we started getting calls from Russia and different places around the world saying, we don't have enough inventory. We don't have enough inventory. We're like, you have plenty of inventory. You have 12 weeks on hand. You have 12 more weeks in Amsterdam. Everything's looking good. And they're like, but we're telling you we don't have inventory. Long story short, the Oracle patch went in and actually took out the parameters in ASCP, Advanced Supply Chain Planning. And so it actually said that the product that was available in the US warehouse was actually already in Russia. So the visibility into the data looks really bad. That it lost and dropped all the in-transit times in the system. So our planners were going home, everything was great, everything was good. And then all of a sudden, a couple weeks into it, it's not looking good. A couple more weeks into it, all heck broke loose. We shut down Oracle and actually managed it in Access as a global supply chain for a couple months to get the parameters going. So team came together really great, but our reliance on data and making sure that the right things were in the right places with the right quantities at the right time was interesting because we relied on this particular system to do it. And unfortunately, a family patch wiped us out. It was probably the biggest learning point in my career that said, don't just look at data, have the conversations, have supplier scorecards, have check-ins, have different people that seem a point of contact for different people around the world to make sure that the data and the systems are also backed up by touch points with the human being early enough in the process. So hopefully that made sense.
Well, that's a great point. I need to throw in here, and I should have done this earlier, for everyone who is tuned in. If you are online, you can ask a question, make a comment at any point you want. There's a Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen, and at any point you can ask questions, and we'll feed them in here. For both of you, when we were talking in advance of this great phrase, leaky buckets, came up. And talk about, what you do when things just aren't optimized. Mike?
Yeah, I think the piece of that is a lot to what Steve was talking about, making sure that you understand those touch points and that the look and feel of the business is working. And so you need to have that level of experience to, with the business and how it should be growing and how it feels, to then find, those leaky buckets where things aren't working like they should, where, whether it's waste in a conversion process or inefficiency in a manufacturing process is really keeping you from optimizing a network. It's one thing if your inventories are impacted by demand variability and forecast accuracy. There are processes to work on that. And that may be your leaky bucket. The other side is that your inventory is a cover for having poor conversion processes, and making sure that you understand, the fact that you're running low efficiency, low conversion effectiveness, that you can fix that and fix inventory. So understanding the whys of the business from a sequential supply chain perspective is really important then to say, okay, here's where, I should focus some effort to assure that I'm getting the best bang for the buck. And, I'm a big believer. I think, again, Steve alluded to this, is about understanding what your core items are and tightening up around those first, because, nine times out of 10, those tend to be those items that make the most for your business and carry the reputation of your business as you look externally.
Thanks, Mike. Steve, does that spark anything for you?
Absolutely. I mean, it's spot on. When I look at leaky buckets too, personally, I tend to look at dollars. Where is the money, right? Where is the money just flowing, unfortunately, in the wrong places or so forth? And sometimes it's in WIP or it's conversion. It's certain things in there. But a lot of times with organizations who have grown fast, which is kind of where I've been a lot of my career, it's in supply chain side of the distribution. I come from more of the e-commerce side of the small parcel distribution. And maybe we're shipping products from one warehouse in Arizona to Maine, for instance, and the cost is just enormous. So we start to look at zone skipping. We start to look at other distribution strategies based on customer data rather than just setting up a contract. We've been able to save millions of dollars by looking at certain 3PL strategies, for instance, that get product to where your base of your customers might be. We've done certain things in other companies where it costs a lot of money and it spent a lot of time, and the frustrations where they're trying to get something to Jamaica, for instance, or trying to get something to one of the islands in Hawaii. And so you start to look at these different perspectives. I actually then typically follow the money of where that is, start plugging the holes where the money is. Everybody gets excited that you save $20 million, $10 million, what it might be. And then you can start to move over into some of the other things. But the big wins for the team are quite important.
Thanks, Steve. There's a question coming in from Peter. What are your most used operational KPIs, OKRs, for growing F&B business?
So I was going to respond to that. I mean, I think, for me, a lot of my time is, on the conversion process. So OEE, or overall equipment effectiveness, is core for me. Throughput, productivity per man hour, person hour, is key. And obviously, as you're looking at your supply chain rates, your order fill, perfect order metrics are key to assure that you're meeting expectations. Days in inventory, turnover days, those are key, particularly as Steve is talking about making sure that how the cash flows and where the leaky buckets are from a cash perspective. If you can shore those up, then you're going to have much better cash flow and much better ability to reinvest to fix the underlying issues.
Great. Steve, any thought on that, Peter's question?
No, I think they're very similar. I would add something in, expiry dates, and it gets back into some of the other horizontal processes of S&OP and so forth. That, okay, marketing, we've got this. So key things that are not just operations focused, but that actually can also move the business. This is how many units. This is our throughput. This is the expiry pieces. And start to just adding on what Mike said, but those are one other place that I would look at is just on the expiration datings and how much cash is there.
Yeah, aging inventory is it's a big issue.
Let's move to another big subject, which is how to retain talent. It's an ongoing issue. There's this huge challenge in manufacturing to get and to retain great talent. Mike, what's the nature of that challenge? What's the owner, the board, to do?
Well, I think we, rightly or wrongly, we've come through this period of wanting to trim costs, thinking that people are evil, and the expense of people can be difficult in the business, and if you have the opportunity, to automate it, it probably makes sense. But the truth of it is that the skill base that come in, with your people is extremely high. And this full employment economy, I think, has had people realize that it's not easy to fill vacancies. It becomes an issue if your real wages, your engagement is lagging others. and you're losing talent, then you've got an issue. And I think the board needs to be focused on two things. First and foremost, culture and engagement. That oftentimes, is going to help with retention when wage disparity isn't significant. You're going to be able to keep people, and sometimes even have people coming because they believe in the mission, they're engaged with the culture. The other piece, I think, is, to be conscious of wages and to make sure that you're moving those according with the market, because I've not encountered a situation where allowing talent to leave and then going through the expense of hiring and retraining and reskilling wins out. So I think it's cheaper and better for a business to retain talent when they can, rather than to feel like they have to recruit on the outside and train.
Steve, thanks, Mike. Steve, what's your thought on the nature of the challenge when it comes to talent?
Yeah, Mike mentioned it. I actually look at culture probably more than most. I really focus on the culture of the company, and it might just because of the amount of companies I've consulted for or been in. It's interesting when you come in as an interim executive. A lot of times, you have to be very politically correct. You have to listen. But people tell you everything. So they tend to tell you everything. I'm like, I'm Switzerland. I'm good. You can tell me everything. But it gives me so much information about where some of the pain points are and where I call the power cores of the organization are. So a lot of times people will say, well, the power core is in sales. And I'm like, yeah, no, the power core is in technology. They control what happens in the company. They tell everybody what's going on, what incentive you can run, what promotion you can run. So a lot of times I like to try to figure out what the power cores are and then what the cultures are around the power cores of the company. So those do have impacts on operations. They do have impacts on different parts of the business. So I look at culture first and foremost. There's Glassdoor reviews. I know a lot of people sit there and say, well, those are just brutal. Sometimes if you take the Gary Vee approach to Glassdoor reviews, we want those people out of the company and they're going to bash the company anyway. But it's good to look at different things when you're going into these organizations. Culture is really big. What's the disbursement of baby boomers versus Gen Xers versus millennials versus interns versus consultants? Because all those different things have an impact on talent, in my opinion. I've seen companies that have amazing processes and do really well. All the talent is external consultants. And so the internal people get ticked off because they don't have the chance to be on the really cool products, projects, etc. So I look at lots of different things when it comes to this. There's lots of variations in my opinion. But to me, culture is important. Who's commuting with who who goes to church together, whose kids go to that network of understanding and what the communications channels are like are quite important. And then retaining the talent is making sure you understand who's the best players and giving them a chance to keep learning and give them mentor programs. Again, sometimes it depends on, are they a Gen Xer or are they a millennial? Some of the differences that motivate them. So understanding the dynamics also of the workforce are quite important as well.
I like hearing, you guys are operationally expert, skilled in your careers, but both of you care very much about culture, which is completely inside the purview of being in senior leadership of the company. Mike, can you talk to Steve's point on culture? Because when we were on one of our prep calls, you said you can't just sit back and think we have a great culture and everything's fine.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear to everybody, and folks, there are kind of superficial efforts that can be made, and then there are real efforts at understanding what culture is. And I think, for a lot of companies that are growing up that may have come up through private ownership, maybe going through generational transition, one of the things that happens as a company grows is those, thought leaders, owners get a little bit further away from the ground level talent. And eventually that has impact on the culture and the sense of connectedness. I think Steve gets to that point quite a bit. So it's about making sure that you're not just doing the engagement survey to take a pulse, but you're doing things about it. You have meaningful programs in place to build skills. And they're not always, one of the most rewarding things I was a part of was helping, an hourly workforce with training on personal finance. We were a little bit frustrated that people weren't participating as highly in a 401k program. And, more, after you have some conversations with folks, you learn that, they're really not managing their finances very well. We did kind of a 10 or 12 week session once a week, with some external folks coming in to talk about personal finance and managing things and what the benefits of a 401k are and different investment opportunities, all kinds of things in balancing checkbooks. And that really drove engagement. It reconnected people again with ownership and leadership that cared about them personally, and really drove engagement throughout. So not always is it finding, the piece of engagement. Sometimes it's a bad leader, bad supervisor, or, those things happen, but it's also about finding the issues that are meaningful in the workplace. I'm certain today that there are all kinds of things around healthcare, that if you spend more time helping people understand what your benefits look like, they'll be more engaged. Those sorts of things. Hope that answers the question, Bob.
Oh, I'm glad you said that. It sparked something because, we wrote a book, a series of interviews with incredible company founders called How They Did It. And one of the guys we interviewed, Dane Miller, he was the founder of Biomet. Biomet kind of created the industry for artificial hips and knees. And Dane told us that every employee from the janitor to the president got equity. And he said the thing they learned over the years was that a lot of people, as soon as they got options that had vested, they would sell them. Or if they had stock, they would sell it, they wouldn't hold it. Biomet rose 30,000% in 25 years. It went from zero to a $12 billion business. And when Dane said that, I kind of gave him a look like, oh my God, these people missed their own fortunes, right? Because they didn't know, or they just, whatever, they had bills. And so I think it's really key what you're bringing up. It's so interesting that helping someone even in their own finances could drive being more loyal to the company and maybe help solve a problem if you can't find enough folks, to be working on the floor. This is also reminding me, I had an Uber ride a couple days ago, and the driver struck me as very smart. Wife, 2 kids, not, making a great living at Uber. And I was like, why don't you become a welder? How about trade school for welding? Because you're going to be employed the rest of your life. I have no idea if that's needed influence. I want to go sideways here because Calvin asked a great question that relates not to the floor, but more to the senior management team. He asked, with regard to the failure example concerning the tech problem with Oracle, it resulted in a Microsoft Access fallback. Was this an organization with a CTO, Chief Technology Officer? How much responsibility did that chief level in technology have? Can you talk about that in terms of not just folks who are down in the organization, but those folks who are in responsibility, especially as technology pervades everything around operations?
Yeah, this is a big company, and yes, there was a CIO, lots of tech folks in place. It unfortunately became very political. So it was a bunch of CYA. No, you said you tested it. No, we didn't test it. It was a little bit of a challenge in there. At the end of the day, it still happened, and everyone had to come together and figure it out for several months. It put tremendous stress on the organization, caused a lot of frayed relationships. And it's actually in my opinion, a perfect example of people versus process. The process failed, so therefore we started blaming people. And so I think that's one of the big lessons that I learned earlier in my career. I was not a C-level executive at the time this happened, but it was early in my career, and I was like, you know what? The process failed. Therefore, it turned into a political people against people, started dividing the entire organization of what side were you on. And it became quite uncomfortable, to be honest with you. Several people lost their jobs. It was very stressful, to the point where it was before Uber. We were sending people home in their 20s because they were having like high blood pressure issues, and we were sending people home in taxis. And it was a tough time. But to answer your question directly, yes, there was tech, and what it did is it put people in front of process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Steve, that puts me in mind of a saying I learned early in my career: tough on issues, soft on people. You know, it's all too familiar a tendency of management versus leadership to be reactive and, you know, point fingers of blame, as opposed to understanding the issue and being tough on the issue and solving the issue at hand, and putting resources into fixing the process, you know, versus scapegoating. You know, there's obviously a need for accountability around the system, and people should learn from their errors and be held accountable. But by the same token, you know, sometimes errors are the greatest invention, and you know, we need to figure out how to take all of that energy and really put it back into processes to fix processes longer term.
So, thanks, Mike. So one of the things that in conversations with you both is how communication flows across an organization. We titled it this Ditch the Vertical Processes, and wondering how you each deal with organizations where communication is not great. Steve, can you talk to that point?
Yeah, kind of going even back to the ordership and pay conversation of structure, I look at processes and most specifically with handoffs, right? So what's the handoff between this department and that department, this group and that group, the collaboration of this group and that group? And so I look at horizontal processes versus vertical processes. So I'll give you two examples. Sales and operations planning should have multiple processes, multiple people and departments in there, maybe 10, 12, 14, depending on the size of your company, maybe 5 or 6 if it's a smaller company. But that horizontal process has sales, marketing, operations, finance, executives, all kinds of people involved in that process. Other process is really important is, in my opinion, on that enterprise level, is the new product development. Again, you've got all kinds of departments in there, and it's the handoffs that cause a lot of the problems. It's those types of things. So I look at things as more horizontal versus vertical, and it's more importantly because if finance is thinking one thing is happening for cash flow, and the ops team is thinking one thing, and the sales team is thinking something, and they're all off, we may have a lot of inventory and low margin and low benefit to the company from a cash flow standpoint. So getting everybody in line in those processes, whether they're quarterly, monthly, every week, if they're stand-ups every morning, it depends on the level of the process, in my opinion, and the people involved. However, that's typically where I'll look at it, is horizontally versus vertical.
Mike, how do you look at it?
Yeah, you know, I agree. I mean, I think the, you know, a key differentiator between, you know, firms that are extremely successful, you know, and kind of regardless of where they are on the maturity spectrum, you know, are how well they've kind of embraced this more collaborative model versus, you know, a more vertical command and control kind of model, a siloed model, if you will, where finance does finance things. And, you know, one of the greatest transformations I've been a part of was the really transformation at Hershey into integrated business planning, to take their S&OP process and really grow it outside of sales and marketing to be an integrated financial product development platform, so that, you know, new products and operational capability were integrated into the plan at a very, from the top to the bottom of the organization, from the senior, board level to the floor level, everybody was on the same page about how quickly new products were going to be coming to market, what their impact was going to be. Hey, not to say that anybody got it right 100% of the time, but the fact that everybody was on the same page as we were moving down the road added a lot of speed to the organization as well as agility, because when questions came up, everybody kind of heard the question at the same time, and the response was team-based as opposed to functional-based. So I think, Steve didn't talk as much about the silos, as I think, may exist in some, more legacy companies, if you will. I guess my background has been principally in, more, traditionally formed, less kind of e-commerce companies, and those silo mentalities still exist and can be a huge drag on a company. When companies embrace collaboration and have a good C-level collaboration, that does, I believe, translate down the organization. And when you set up processes to be collaborative, I think it really is a huge benefit to the organization to be more responsive, more creative, and actually faster, because everybody's on the same page.
I think that's a great point, and silo is a perfect word here in how to create a collaborative process. Let's move on to onshore versus offshore, because I recently read this book called The Absent Superpower. It's by a guy named Peter Zion. He makes the argument that because the U.S. has become energy independent, thanks to shale production, even when you see price drops, the U.S. now can produce all of its own energy. But he makes the argument that because of that, the post-World War II order, the Bretton Woods order is gone. I'm not making this as a political argument, but clearly there are things going on in the world where you would look at the U.S. and say it is becoming more, maybe not isolationist, but clearly independent of the need for world markets. And I'm curious how that you each might see this affecting folks onshoring manufacturing operations versus what that massive drive for offshore was. Steve, can you talk to that point?
Sure, yeah. I think we're seeing a combination, in my opinion, we're seeing a combination of both. I know even this year with some of the trade challenges with China and so forth, people were getting nervous and they started moving to Korea, Taiwan, and other countries, Germany, for certain types of things. I look at things, it also depends on the type of company. So I'll give you my background in some of the recent companies are B corporations. So we focus on people, profit, and planet. And we actually try to keep the carbon footprint low, the transportation costs and the transportation footprints low. And so if it's a little bit more expensive to procure something here in the United States, certain types of tubes for skincare and so forth, we'll procure them here for an extra 15, 20 cents per tube versus the footprint of going to another country. So I see, at least I work with a lot of founder CEOs as well at times, and they're on the B corporation side, they try to keep things more strategically focused on the US, where it's more commoditized or where it's more focused on non-strategic type of things. We tend to look around the world for certain things of that nature. But we did see, at least I saw, and especially in my network of people were very nervous about some of the China stuff going on. And we did move operations and manufacturing of certain things out of China into different places, knowing that it would cost a little bit more money. But the comfort factor that we wouldn't have to deal with an external threat to certain parts of the supply chain was offset that margin issue. And so that's what we've seen in our side. Again, skincare, cosmetics, nutrition is where I've been. And then sometimes we get into that conversation with the consumer related to where your raw materials are coming from as well. So understanding that and being fully transparent. I again, I have a little bit different background than some because we were very transparent. We were focused on changing certain regulations in the U.S. for skincare, et cetera. So we were putting a very big visible target on where we did certain things and where we moved stuff and where we were procuring and how we were offsetting carbon footprint. So that's a little bit more of my background. It's a little bit more specific than some of the other stuff.
I love it. People, profit, planet. Mike, how about you? What are you seeing in onshoring versus offshoring?
You know, I think, you know, you guys have both hit on a little bit of what's going on. The uncertainty that exists, you know, when you offshore is always going to be a factor. I think the growth in footprint and the growth in complexity is something that has to be measured very cautiously, I guess, with a great deal of conservatism, I would say. You want to look at a very long historical window to think about, you know, how reliable, in fact, sourcing can be. You know, we have, you know, and I've had the opportunity to work internationally, and I think Steve brought up this point, you know, of where do you know, if you've got a business that's based in Asia, you know, where do you source? And there's different perceptions within Asia. I mean, for us as Americans, to answer that question, you know, you say you source in the lowest cost country, but that may not always be the solution because of cultural sensitivities or trade barriers within, you know, the Asian markets. So understanding, you know, all of those things, I think really, you know, bring complexity with it when you offshore, to the extent that you can keep significant portions of your business onshore for reliability and consistency purposes. I think you have to evaluate those trade-offs to say that as long as it's affordable for the business, I think the reliability index, particularly with expectations today, I mean, you know, kind of outside of, you know, in the food and beverage business, we're less sensitive to the, you know, Amazon Prime phenomenon of having my razors tomorrow, or, you know, having that fulfillment such. I mean, I think people still, they're experimenting with it and people are trying it, you know, to get produce and food delivered the same way, but it's not quite the same quite yet, you know, particularly on shorter shelf life or fresh products. So I think the opportunity to keep things onshore for supply chain reliability is pretty great. I think the decision to offshore should be made when the economics are overwhelming, and or there's a local market exploitation opportunity that allows you to open a new market because of your sourcing decision.
I want to change gears on you guys here. We wanted to talk about, you know, recognizing to help the owner and the board think about what is core to the company. But I want to approach it more personally to the two of you. Why do boards, why do owners bring you in? Is there value to an outsider coming in for a company to figure out what is core, what is most important? Steve?
Yeah, I kind of built a lot of my consulting strategy on that exact question, which is kind of funny you pivoted to it. So I was doing a lot of consulting for a long time around, let me just do a health check of your organization. So ordership and pay was part of it, but there's all the other pieces of it too. Let me just give you about, you know, I was getting my wedge in the door as a consultant by coming in and saying to the board and to the executives, you know, I will come in with a non-emotional, data-driven approach. So there's definitely emotions, there's definitely guts, there's definitely other pieces to run the company. But, you know, I'll come in and do an audit of your company, kind of like a health check of when you go to the doctor every few, you know, 6 months to a year. And so we'll come in and do this analysis and we'd look at different pieces and say to them, you know, here's kind of your leaky buckets going back to there. Here's your low-hanging fruit. Here's some of your strategic areas. But listen, this is where I see certain things. You're focusing a lot on strategy and not on growth, or you're focusing a lot on growth and not on margin. And so we would come in and analyze the data of the company and look at certain things. Sometimes that irritates the finance team or the FP&A team or the strategy team. However, the board sometimes wants this kind of third-party approach to say, okay, everything looks good in these areas. This is where we're focused. Okay, that validates us. Or, hey guys, let's kick over a few more rocks in this specific area. And back in my more of the consulting day that I was doing it, I would do that a lot of times to say, if you don't like the answers that I'm giving you, then don't pay me. Because I had confidence that I would find certain things and our team would find certain things. But yeah, I like that type of kind of health check. I actually think it's great that some executives will be open to that and kind of move the ego a little bit to the side and say, I do want to move to the next level. What do you think is holding us back? Because when you're close to it every day and you're inside it every day and you have that emotion to it every day, sometimes it allows you to make decisions that you probably shouldn't be making. But this is just another data point that allows an outside executive to come in, analyze certain things, again, without emotion and show a different perspective potentially. There's a lot of benefit in that. As an executive, I'm very open to that. You got to, again, sometimes put the ego to a side, but I'm very open to it because there are a lot of smarter people out there in the world than myself. And sometimes it's really great to get that feedback.
Yeah, Steve, that's great. Mike, what drives you to want to be project-based?
Yeah, I think Steve's spot on with it. There's the opportunity really to be frank and help people see, kind of what they're driving toward and whether their actions line up with intentions. You can have a leadership team, a board that's talking about growth, as Steve pointed out, but they're really, kind of focused elsewhere, in terms of what their day-to-day actions are. And as an interim, you're able to hold up a light to that. I think there's an expectation to speak frankly. I think that's, the opportunity, sometimes with, a bigger consulting firm, you'll get some of that, depending on the relationship and who you're dealing with individuals that bring in that portfolio. It can be a lot more targeted. I agree with Steve in terms of looking across the business. There are, always pockets that you can point to and say, do the intentions in this area line up with the actions? Does the real strength of the business fit to what your vision is? If you've got a broad portfolio of items, but only 5 or 10 of those items, make up 85 or 90% of your business, to be thinking about being a real diversified company isn't necessarily consistent with what you are. And are your actions really driving you to a point where you can become what your intentions are? So I think that's really important, is to recognize, what's core, what's trend or fashion based on, things that people have heard or things that people want to explore, and what really are the capabilities of the business and the skill sets that reside, and do you have the right talent to fulfill your intentions?
Mike, I know that when you go in on an engagement, you're starting, we call it operational roadmap. It's assessment and discovery. Then you move into this execution and implementation phase. And can you share a little bit more about what your process is?
Sure. Again, being focused a lot on conversion, it's really about understanding, what's core within the portfolio, and are the resources and processes that support those core items as effective as they could be. So as you go in and kind of simple things, the ABC analysis, those AI items that make up 60 to 80% of sales and are often less than 20% of the mix, require, if you get more efficient at those, you can generate a lot of cash to help drive growth, to help drive innovation to help do different things. And I think you can really call the company's attention to, are you as good in that space? Are you as competitive in that space as you believe you are, by bringing in some external benchmarking and just checking with the market to assure that your core is relevant and well defended, and that your processes really align behind that in terms of how you execute and go to market each day.
Thanks, Mike. Steve, I want to move on with you to 2020. It's not just a new year; it's a new decade. And what are the things should owners and boards be thinking about? Does blockchain figure in here? What's your crystal ball showing in terms of what owners should be on the lookout for?
Depends on the type of company. However, again, I'll speak to what I do mostly on the e-commerce side. It's acquisition of customers, customer retention, customer service, all that piece. Now, operations has a major role to play. Again, order, ship, and pay is a major role to make sure all that is supported. Blockchain, so to me, customer acquisition is amazingly changed, right? So influencers, affiliates, you name it. There's a whole bunch, probably a whole different webinar on all that kind of stuff. But on the blockchain side of things and those types of more forward-looking, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, machine learning, those are amazing. Don't get me wrong, I love all that stuff. What I find as an interim executive with the clients and the people that I'm working with is that they can't even get the basics done on technology. So to think blockchain is such a forward-thinking possibility that they're like, it's not around them. They're so focused on the tactics. So going into a new decade, they're still trying to plug the holes and their inefficiencies in certain areas. I like blockchain. I like certain things about it. I think it's pretty amazing. But getting a CIO's head around it, their director's head around it, their developers' head around it. Do we outsource it? Do we keep it in-source? Again, that is another one of those places of, well, why do they get to work on the cutting edge stuff versus us? Whereas the skill transfer, so kind of what we've talked about throughout, the concepts are fantastic. It comes down into the type of company, the type of leadership, are you willing to put certain other things on hold that are maybe pet projects to come into that future of things? I sit on the board of an AI machine learning company. I'm fascinated by the stuff that they're doing, fascinated by the stuff. I'll pitch it to companies all the time, like, hey, you might want to take a look at this. Hey, I'm on the board, so there is a transparency there. And every single time it's like, great, I got to walk before I can run. So we're still walking in so many companies, and some companies are still crawling. So even though that there's some amazing things on the horizon, the execution capabilities and the leadership capabilities are still on the kind of the crawl walk days, rather than allowing some people to sprint. And hopefully that makes sense. But I still see, and again, maybe that's because of the type of work I do. I sit with more companies that are in trouble, rather than non. And so they're dealing with just crawling on a day-to-day basis rather than looking at blockchain and so forth.
That's great. Mike, you get the final word.
Wow. Yeah. So
2020.
Yeah, I think Steve hit on it pretty well. The technology stuff is out there and very, very enticing. I think, I'm think of myself as a lean practitioner, and I think when you talk about those sort of leading edge technologies, if you can't go through a 5 why on, why would I do blockchain, and ask the question why, 5 or 6 times as you progress into the reasons, beyond, it's kind of trendy and, it's what Walmart wants or some other things. If you can't get down to real root problems that it solves, I think the main thing that blockchain is intended to bring is visibility and accountability in transactions, from a sourcing perspective, I think it's great from a food quality perspective, the things that it can bring. If you can't answer those 5 whys pretty consistently with what's important to your business, not 5 years from now, but today, then it's probably too soon to embark on that, because I think Steve points it out really well that, you know, there's so many basic operations that need improvement, basic processes within most companies that need attention and improvement. To spend a lot of time and resources on something so novel and still so fungible, changing, that's a misplacement of resources. I think the other thing is to redouble efforts in 2020 on people retention, on building culture and really trying to make your human team as impervious to risk as you can. And that's a very broad statement, but I think it begins with culture and engagement.
Guys, this has been great. And we didn't come in with a preset notion of what would be of greatest value to owners and boards and investors who would be listening in on this call. But what I got from it and take away, I'm giving you my little lightning round summation, was that you have to have a framework. It's not just about the data. Steve, you mentioned this phrase, the power cores of the company and the culture. And Mike, you just reinforced how culture is so important. I love this example of what drove engagement in the company, that the company helped folks even on the factory floor with their own personal finance education. Steve, you talked about looking at the handoffs between departments, that silos. Mike, you mentioned silos. It's a drag. You have to embrace a collaborative process. The phrase, Steve, people, profit, planet, I think that's a wonderful mantra. And Mike, you finished it up perfectly with answering these 5 whys for a better 2020. So thank you to everyone who has listened in and participated with questions on this webinar. This concludes our chat with expert interim COOs. We will post a blog and audio of this. Thank you to everyone. This concludes our webinar.